Here is your friend Thomas the Tank Engine. He wanted to come out of his station yard and see the world. These stories tell you how he did it.
Hello everybody, this is Elsbridge Studios, and this is the first video of the updated version of my series, History of Sodor, sort of. I will at some point go back to my previous videos and re-record them, and in between times I shall also be uploading new ones, starting with today's episode, the History of the Railway series. Sort of. Today I plan to take a detailed dive into the history of this book series, the TV series, and various other creations which have come about as a result of these popular children's stories, as well as plenty of behind-the-scenes trivia. So, with that out of the way, let's begin. The story begins over 80 years ago, back in 1942. At this point, most of the nations in Europe, and indeed the world, were at war. Chaos and destruction everywhere. However, the railways of Britain were working harder than they ever had before. They were an inspiration to many people, and in particular, one church reverend called Wilbert Vere Awdry. Like his father before him, Awdry had a great interest in trains from a young age, particularly those found on the Great Western Railway. To him, the noises the engines made sound like they were talking to each other. For example, the big engine struggling to get their train up the hill would appear to say, "I can't do it, I can't do it," whilst the little engine pushing behind would seem to reply, "I will do it, I will do it," all the way up the hill. Awdry kept this fascination of trains well into his adulthood, and that brings us to 1942. At this time, Awdry lived in Birmingham with his wife Margaret, son Christopher, and daughter Veronica. He later had another daughter called Hilary, but wasn't born until after the war had ended. In 1942, Christopher unfortunately caught measles and was bedridden as a result. Since this was before the invention of video games, the internet, and social media, Wilbert would entertain Christopher by telling him nursery rhymes and stories. Christopher's favourite being the nursery rhyme, "Down by the Station." Wilbert even drew Christopher a picture of a group of steam engines with faces, one of which looked very sad. Naturally, Christopher asked why the engine was sad. Wilbert explained that the engine's name was Edward, and that he hadn't been let out of the shed in a long time, and then told him the story about the day Edward was let out again. Christopher liked this story about the railway and asked his father for more. So his father then told him a story about a big and boastful engine called Gordon, who had been named after a very rude boy that lived on the same street as the Awdry family. In this story, Gordon was put in his place when he got stuck on a steep hill and another engine had to help him. Wilbert also told Christopher a story about an engine called Henry, who was afraid of ruining his paint in the rain, and so he hid in a tunnel and wouldn't come out again. Wilbert did tell Christopher many other stories, but they soon lost their entertainment value. But even long after he'd recovered from his measles, Christopher still asked to hear these three particular stories. Wilbert's wife Margaret was also fascinated by these stories and tried to convince him to have these stories published, as she believed They were far better than most other children's books available at the time. Awdry was reluctant at first, but he eventually agreed, and so he sent the stories to his mother Lucy, as she happened to know the author Michael Barsley. Barsley and his agent tried numerous times to find a publisher for the book, but to no avail. The problem was there was still a war going on, and for those of you who didn't cover this in school, Britain introduced a rationing scheme, primarily for food, but also for clothes and even paper, which meant most publishers had a paper shortage. However, in September of 1943, Edmund Ward agreed he would publish the stories, but much to Awdry's annoyance, he wouldn't give a set date. He did write to Awdry about a month later, saying that the stories would be published in a single book with 3 railway engines, but he needed rough sketches for his illustrator, so he had something to base the pictures off of, and he also said that Awdry needed to write a final story for the book, which gave the 3 engines a happy ending. Awdry was rather annoyed by these requests, but he agreed, and so he wrote Edward, Gordon and Henry to complete the book. But because of the war, the book, The 3 Railway Engines, was not published until the 12th of May in 1945. The book was a commercial success and quickly sold out the first print run of about 22,500 copies, which is a lot in those days, and it had 2 more runs within the same year. So quite popular indeed. However, despite being pleased that his book was finally being sold, Awdry hated the illustrations made by William Middleton. In fact, Awdry didn't seem to get on well with many of his illustrators, but we'll cover that in more detail later. Whilst Wilbert Awdry was waiting for his book to be published, he used an old broomstick handle to make a toy version of Edward for Christopher to play with, and gathered enough materials to make some matching coaches and trucks. The story goes that Christopher asked for a toy of Gordon so he could reenact the story where he got stuck on the hill and Edward had to help him. However, Wilbert Awdry had a few issues building this toy of Gordon, so instead he built a small tank engine, and he gave it to Christopher as a Christmas present. Christopher loved his new toy and named it Thomas. Wilbert thought that by doing this he would finally get some peace, but in reality he would not get any peace until he'd created some stories about Thomas as well. Together, the 2 Awdrys created stories about a station pilot who was bored of shunting in the yard and wanted to go out and see the world. Once again, Awdry's wife Margaret convinced him to have these stories published. The result was Thomas the Tank Engine, first published on the 14th of September in 1946. However, Awdry insisted that a new illustrator was found, as he believed that Middleton's drawings were terribly unrealistic, even more so than his original sketches, and that they looked more like toys than real engines, and many technical details were missing. So this time the illustration duties went to Reginald Payne. Payne's illustrations were a massive improvement and set the standard for the Railway series illustrations going forward. However, Awdry was still displeased. He was happy that he had an illustrator that actually knew what a steam engine looked like and how to draw it, but he wasn't happy that the engines didn't look like any real engines in particular. However, Awdry's biggest issue was Thomas himself. The original toy of Thomas that he'd built was based off of a London North Eastern Railway J50 class tank engine, although it more closely resembled a J51. Payne, however, spent a lot of time in the south of England whilst he was working for the Admiralty. A common sight that he saw whilst he was there was Billington's E2 tank engine, built for the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway. And so this is what Payne used as a basis for his illustrations. Awdry allowed it, as it was at least a real type of engine. But there were some inaccuracies that he could not overlook, the main one being the footplate. An E2's footplate slopes at both the front and the rear down to the buffer beams. However, in Payne's illustration, Thomas's footplate only slopes down at the front, and his rear buffer beam is extended downwards to compensate. This led to Awdry to believe that the buffers were at different heights, and so didn't function properly. Aside from that, however, the other issues were only minor. And with that, the series came to an end. Except it didn't. Awdry and his family moved so he could become the vicar at Ellsworth and Knapwell. He wasn't planning to continue writing stories about trains, but due to popular demand, he was convinced to carry on. So, in 1948, Wilbert and his brother George began making notes and sketches, eventually creating the fictional island of Sodor and the main railway that served it, the North Western Railway, run by the Fat Director, or Fat Controller as he was known in later books, Sir Topham Hatt. The Awdry brothers also set about creating a backstory for each of the 5 engines that had been introduced so far, and assigning them a real-life engine class. This proved a challenge, but I'll come back to that in a minute. Whilst this was going on, Awdry began writing stories for his next book, all about James, the engine that Thomas had saved at the end of the previous book. Interestingly, James was named after the friend of the publisher's son. Anyway, to make these stories seem as realistic as possible, Awdry took inspiration from real-life events. The story, James and the Top Hat, in which he let off a cloud of steam and it poured all over the Fat Controller's top hat, was inspired by a real-life event that Awdry himself witnessed whilst he was travelling in Belgium. And the story, James and the Bootlace, was based off of an article from the Railway Gazette. All Awdry needed now was for Reginald Payne to draw the pictures. It was only then that Awdry and his publisher discovered that a year prior to this, Payne had found life in the Admiralty far too much and suffered a severe mental breakdown, which led to his death. Without an illustrator, Awdry decided to do the drawings himself, but whilst he was capable of drawing trains and railway infrastructure, he had difficulties with people and scenery. To solve this, he turned to the headmistress of Knapwell School, Barbara Bean, whose hobby was sketching, and asked her for help, and she agreed. However, by the time the two of them had finished the drawings, the publisher had already hired C. Reginald Dalby as the series illustrator. Dalby stuck very closely to the style of Payne's drawings, which unfortunately meant he included most of the inaccuracies, which really annoyed Awdry. It was no secret that Awdry hated most of Dalby's drawings, as the trains didn't look like real-life engines. Thomas and Edward could easily be put down as an illustration error, whilst Gordon and James were said to be one-off experimental versions of existing engines. But neither Payne or Dalby could illustrate Henry to look like a real-life engine, and when the next engine introduced in the series was drawn, this of course being Percy, he too didn't look like any engine in particular. Although it probably doesn't help that every illustrator seemed to draw Percy as a different engine. Regardless, Audrey had hoped, as time went on, Darby's drawings would stick closer to real life. But after seeing his drawings for James the Red Engine, Tank Engine Thomas again, and Troublesome Engines, it was clear that these inaccuracies were here to stay, and for some time. Audrey instead focused on his stories. At this point, he planned to write Henry out of the series because he hated Darby's drawings of him that badly. However, Henry had become a popular character in the series, so Audrey needed a new idea, one that would let him keep Henry, but also fix his appearance. So he came up with the idea to write a story where Henry had a bad accident and would need to be partially rebuilt, which would allow Audrey to change Henry into real-life engine class, specifically a Stania Black 5. At some point around this time, the Audrey family went on holiday to Yarmouth. Whilst they were there, Wilbert and Christopher were lucky enough to enjoy a cab ride in one of the J70 steam trams. This inspired the next book in the railway series, Toby the Tram Engine, in which one of his tram engines would come to Sodor. (1953) was a busy year for the railway series. A year prior to this, a man named Robert Mitchell had heard some of the railway series stories on the radio and decided to write a letter to Frida Lindström, who at the time was in charge of the British Broadcasting Company, or BBC's, children's television department, suggesting that the BBC adapt the railway series for television. Lindström agreed, and so in February of 1953 they both approached the series editor, Eric Marriott. They asked him for the rights to adapt 2 stories from the book, The Three Railway Engines, in order to make a pilot episode, and if all went well, hopefully an entire series. Marriott, Audrey and the publisher all agreed, and so production began. The man in charge of production was Douglas Mair. He contacted the toy company and model train manufacturer Meccano and asked them to supply the trains. Meccano sent Mair 3 Coronation-class engines and an N2 tank engine on the condition that the only alteration he could make was to put faces on the smoke box doors. This angered Audrey, as the models looked nothing like what they did in the books. The BBC tried to convince him otherwise, but to no avail. Unsurprisingly, Audrey stood his ground. So, Audrey's publisher had the models sent to Peter Wickham, a friend of Audrey's who had collaborated with him on model railways many times in the past. Wickham modified the tank engine to look more like Thomas, and he modified 2 of the Coronation-class models to look like Henry and Gordon. He also made models of James pretty much from scratch, as well as a model for Edward in pretty much the same fashion. Audrey was now happy with these models, as they now looked much closer to their representation in the books, but this was far from the end of the BBC's troubles. Marriott brought the completed models to the studio, where filming was to commence on the 10th of June. To his surprise, the set on which filming was taking place wasn't finished yet, and the episode was due to be broadcast in just a few days' time on the 14th. In fact, when the set was finally ready to go, there was only enough time for 2 rehearsals before the episode was broadcast. During these rehearsals, they discovered yet more problems. Edward's model didn't run properly and even broke down halfway through the actual broadcast, and so his role had to be taken over by the model of James. As for Henry, his tender had the wrong coupling on it, which made it difficult for the model to pull a train. but perhaps the most well-known moment from the BBC pilot remains debated. Officially, the coupling issue with Henry's model caused it to derail, although there are many claims that it was in fact James's model that derailed at a set of points that weren't set properly. Regardless, seeing as the BBC's policy at the time was to broadcast live, everybody watching the pilot episode could see a hand reach down from the top of the screen and put the train back on the track. Hundreds of parents sent letters to both Audrey and the BBC complaining about the shoddiness of the pilot episode. Less than a week later, Audrey sent the BBC an ultimatum. Either the BBC would strive to prevent mistakes such as these in the future, or they could cancel the show entirely. Due to the negative feedback the BBC had received, they opted to cancel the second episode before production had begun. As for the pilot episode itself, this photograph of James's model is one of the very few documents that have survived. The episode itself was broadcast live, as was BBC policy at the time, meaning it is very unlikely that it was actually recorded. And even if it was, the BBC had a habit of wiping over old film, so it's almost certain that the original footage has not survived and has all been wiped from history. But this was not the last time somebody attempted to adapt a railway series for TV. After the failed TV pilot, Audrey went back to writing books. Gordon the Big Engine was published just 5 days after the pilot was aired. In this book, the Big Express engine got himself into big trouble and was made to pull trucks as a punishment. A little over a year later, Edward the Blue Engine was published. In this story, Edward shows how useful he is, despite being almost 30 years older than most of the other engines on the railway. Like most of Audrey's stories, these stories were primarily based off of real-life events. In fact, that one story, Saved from Scrap, was based off of Audrey's close friend, Reverend Teddy Boston. Boston first met Audrey back in 1949 when he came to see Audrey's model railway, and the two almost immediately became close friends. Over the years, Boston bought and restored 2 narrow-gauge steam engines and a traction engine called Fiery Elias. When Audrey heard about this story, he decided he would write a similar story with the Island of Sodor, in which the Vicar of Wellsworth would save a traction engine called Trevor from being scrapped. Things were going well at this point, but Audrey wanted to try something different. By this point, he and his family had been volunteers on the Tallyclyn Railway near Tywyn in Wales for a few years. During this time, he had seen the railway's number 1, Tallyclyn, left in an open-air shed, the number 2, Dolgok, being sent away for an overhaul, and the arrival of 2 new engines, Sir Hayden and Edward Thomas, numbers 3 and 4 respectively. Audrey spent much of his time on the Tallyclyn Railway working as a guard, but supposedly he did other jobs too. And then one day he had a bright idea. Why not have a narrow gauge railway on Sodor too? With permission granted by the Tallyclyn Railway, Audrey set about creating the nearly identical Skarloey Railway. In fact, most of the engines on the Skarloey Railway are said to be twins with their Tallyclyn counterparts, and have each experienced very similar events. Skarloey Remembers, the first story in the book, was based on Tallyclyn being left in an open-air shed for a long time, but being allowed out to pull trains again. Tallyclyn and Dolgok both had long wheelbases, which meant they couldn't fit around some of the tight corners on the railway. To solve this, the track was widened by 1/2 inch. That may not sound like a lot, but this meant Sir Hayden, which had a very short wheelbase, would push the rails apart and sink down between them, as well as occasionally derailing. This became the inspiration for the story of Sir Handel. Finally, the story Peter Sam and the Refreshment Lady was inspired by an event that happened to Audrey himself. One day, when it was Audrey's turn to be the guard, he gave the train permission to leave too early, and accidentally left a passenger behind. To make matters worse, the passenger in question was the driver's mother-in-law. Oops. Nevertheless, Audrey ploughed on and presented his next book, Four Little Engines, to his publisher. The publisher wasn't too keen on the idea of a narrow gauge railway, but Audrey convinced him to print the book anyway. The Skarloey Railway and its engines were instant hits, and so they made many more appearances over the years. It also saw the creation of a permanent link between Audrey and the Talyllyn Railway. If you visit the museum at Towyn Station, you will see that much of the upper floor is dedicated to Audrey. It contains his model railways, a three-dimensional map of the island of Sodor, and numerous other railway series memorabilia. It is well worth a visit. Between his stints on the Talyllyn Railway, and obviously working as a vicar, the Reverend Audrey also spent a fair amount of time working on his model railways. This included building a model of Thomas, Percy and Toby, which he had taken to exhibitions since 1949 to display on his model of Farquhar Station. Audrey also had a spare engine, a Great Western Railway 5700 class tank engine, which unfortunately had a misshaped wheel. This meant as it made its way along, it looked as though it was waddling like a duck. This inspired Audrey's children to name the engine Duck, a name that stuck long after the wheels were fixed. When it came to writing his next book, Audrey decided that he wanted to add another character to the series, but he didn't know where to start. But then he remembered his spare engine, Duck. He decided this would be the perfect engine to turn into a character, and so Duck first appeared in the next book, Percy the Small Engine. In this book, Duck came to take over Percy's job in the main yard so that Percy could help Thomas on his branch line. However, Dalby incorrectly drew Duck as a 6400 class instead of a 5700 class like he was supposed to. Audrey was annoyed by this. He'd also had enough of Dalby's illustrations of Percy too, and said that Percy looked like a green caterpillar with red stripes, a line that he coincidentally used in a later book. Having heard nothing but criticism for Audrey since its beginning, this was the last straw for Dalby, and he refused to illustrate any more of Audrey's books. Audrey wasn't too fussed about Dalby walking out, and instead of worrying about an illustrator, he just focused on writing the stories for his next book, The 8 Famous Engines. Without Dalby as the illustrator, it was up to the publisher to find a replacement, and so he settled on John T. Kenny. In Audrey's opinion, Kenny was a much better illustrator than Dalby, and his pictures were much more realistic. And so, Audrey was happy, or at least, happier. Following this, Audrey wanted to create a book all about Duck, but his publisher wanted a book about a diesel engine, since it was 1958 and diesel engines had been popping up all over the UK for the last decade or so, and this would make the series up to date. Audrey was furious about this, but since it was right about a diesel engine, or not write a book at all, he went along with it. But he wasn't going to let his publisher have the last word. In the book, titled Duck and the Diesel Engine, we are introduced to a diesel engine simply called Diesel, and we experience his trial period on Sodor from Duck's perspective. Since Audrey much preferred steam engines, he purposely portrayed diesel engines as devious, mistrustworthy, and rather bad-tempered. He made Diesel the first villain in the Railway series, which Audrey hoped would not only keep his publisher happy, but also stop him from making such requests like this in the future. That was not the case, but we'll talk about that later. This book also had a jab made at Dolby's expense by the illustrator. In one of the illustrations, as you can see here, Audrey is stood next to Dolby, allegedly having dragged him all the way to Sodor to show him what Duck is supposed to look like. The other key thing about this book is it is the first story in the Railway series to include a real-life engine, that being Great Western Railway number 3440, City of Truro, allegedly the first engine to reach 100 miles an hour. Although, as Gordon pointed out in the same story, that was never proven. Despite this, City of Truro proved to be quite popular, and as such, many more real-life engines made appearances in the Railway series further down the line. By 1959, the Tallyclin Railway had acquired 2 new engines, a little diesel to help out with maintenance work, and another steam engine that was rather problematic. This led to the creation of Audrey's next book, The Little Old Engine, in which the Skarloey Railway acquired a little diesel of its own, called Rusty, as well as a new steam engine called Duncan, that caused all sorts of chaos. It is unknown what exactly inspired the next book in the series, the Twin Engines. In this book, the Fat Controller buys a new engine to help with goods trains, but somehow ends up with a pair of identical twins called Donald and Douglas, which cause him no end of chaos and confusion. And it wasn't just the controller of the North Western Railway facing issues. Audrey was having issues with his next book, Branch Line Engines. Audrey was under pressure from his publisher to add a diesel to the North Western Railway, and Audrey also wanted to fix Thomas's buffer beam issue. He decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and write a story where Thomas would have an accident and would require his buffer beam to be repaired, and while he was away, a diesel rail car called Daisy would take over his work. The only problem was that Thomas crashed Smokebox first, which meant instead of his rear buffer beam being dropped to match his front one, the front one was raised to match the level of the footplate, meaning it was completely flat. Although strangely, this didn't seem to bother Audrey too much. What did bother him was what came after the book was published. A railwayman wrote a letter to Audrey saying the crash that happened in the last story, Percy's Predicament, was too unrealistic and could not possibly have happened in real life. Audrey responded by sending him the article from the Model Railway magazine about this incident that inspired this particular story, including a picture. The incident in question happened at Swanley Junction back in 1876. Meanwhile, Dolgok had returned to the Tallyclin Railway after an extensive overhaul, so Audrey decided that their Railway series counterpart, Renius, would return to the Skarloey Railway, as well as telling some more real-life inspired stories in his next book, Gallant Old Engine. This brings us to 1962. By this point, British Railways, which ran most of Britain's railways, had replaced the vast majority of their old steam engines with newer diesel engines. However, in 1960, a group of people saved an engine called Stepney from being scrapped and took him to Sussex, where they bought a short line that had recently closed. This railway is called the Bluebell Railway, and their mission is to save as many steam engines from scrap as possible. This caught the attention of Reverend Awdry, who paid them a visit. Awdry felt the work that the Bluebell Railway was doing was inspirational, and it also gave him an idea for his next book, Stepney, the Bluebell Engine, in which Stepney would come from his home on the Bluebell Railway all the way to the island of Sodor to help out, and have many adventures while he was there. This was done to promote both the Bluebell Railway and the idea of preservation in general. However, Awdry did face one problem with this book. The illustrator, John T. Kenny, had retired due to his rapidly failing eyesight, and a new illustrator was required. The series editor, Eric Marriott, approached Gunvor Edwards and asked her to have a go at illustrating the book. Gunvor's illustrations were quite good, but she struggled with the small size of the pictures, approximately 10 by 6 inches, or roughly 25 by 15 centimeters. So she turned to her husband Peter. Peter was able to help Gunvor finish the illustrations for this book and then illustrated the rest of the books by Wilbert Awdry, but at his insistence, both he and Gunvor were credited, despite Peter doing almost all of the work. Gunvor and Peter's style was very different to previous illustrators and often seen as a lot more realistic. This was because the Edwards family would often go to see real trains from which Peter could draw inspiration for his drawings. The following year, Awdry decided to adapt another real-life railway onto the island of Sodor. His plan for his next book, called Mountain Engines, was inspired by a trip to the Snowdon Mountain Railway in Snowdonia in Wales. Much like the Tallyclin Railway, the Snowdon Mountain Railway's history was copied almost exactly to create the very similar Coldey Fell Railway on Sodor, and all 4 stories in the book are based off of real events that happened on the Snowdon Mountain Railway. And to make sure that the pictures were as accurate as possible, the illustrators went to Snowdon Mountain Railway to see their engines. The following year, in 1965, the Tallyclin Railway celebrated its 100th anniversary. So, to celebrate, Awdry wrote his next book, Very Old Engines, about the history of the Skarloey Railway and how it celebrated its 100th anniversary. Awdry's next adventure was to the port of Par, where he found a pair of low-cab tank engines called Alfred and Judy. They'd been built with low cabs to fit under the low bridge under the main line. This inspired Awdry to create Bill and Ben, low-cab tank engine twins that worked at the port on Edwards branch line, and first appeared in the next book, Mainline Engines. Awdry and Boston then went on a visit to the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway in Cumbria. During these visits, there were a few mishaps. This led to the creation of Awdry's next book, Small Railway Engines, in which he and Boston went to the Arsdale Railway on Sodor, more commonly known as the Small Railway, and experienced a number of similar incidents to those that they witnessed on the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway. In Awdry's next book, Enterprising Engines, we saw another famous engine visit Sodor. In this book, Gordon is depressed because many steam engines, including most of his siblings, have been scrapped. So, to cheer him up, the Fat Controller arranges for Gordon's only surviving sibling, the famous Flying Scotsman, to come to Sodor to help out during the tourist season. This book also introduced us to a new character, a 1400 class auto tank engine called Oliver. This was so that there were 2 Great Western Railway engines to run what was now called the Little Western Branch Line, ready for Awdry's next book, Oliver the Western Engine. However, in the foreword of this book, Awdry has written a letter to his wife Margaret about a falling out with his publishers, who had insisted on having a character's name in the title. It reads, "Dear M, we both wanted to call this book Little Western Engines. but publishers are stern men. They did not approve. They, of course, don't know the trouble he's had with Oliver. We hope he has learnt sense, but goodness knows what will happen when he finds out he has a book to himself. I know. If Oliver gets uppish, we'll set Messrs. K and Ward onto him. That'll teach him. W. In 1970, Awdry published the book Juke the Lost Engine. This saw him and Reverend Boston visit Sodor to find an old engine called Juke, who had been missing for a long time. This was inspired by the real-life engine Colonel Church, which had been lost in the Amazon rainforest and was found 30 years later. Awdry's final book for the railway series, Tramway Engines, was published on the 15th of October 1972. And it was at this point that it was believed that the railway series had finally come to an end. But in reality, that was nowhere near the case. By this point in time, the railway series had come to the attention of Shuyu Shimizu. No idea if I've pronounced that correctly, probably not. Anyway, Shimizu was born and raised in Japan, but moved to England to teach Japanese language and culture at Oxford University before moving back to Japan to teach English. Whilst he was in England, Shimizu stumbled across some of the railway series books and bought them to share with his son, who thoroughly enjoyed them. In 1972, an acquaintance of his, Saburo Kuwabara, suggested that he translated the railway series into Japanese. With permission from both Awdry and his publishers, a Japanese translation of the first 26 books in the railway series were published. This was just the beginning of the railway series trip around the globe, as at least some of the stories were translated into German, Norwegian, Mandarin, Welsh, and even Korean, as well as some books also being published in America and in Australia. In 1973, a chap called Andrew Lloyd Webber came up with the idea to adapt the railway series for television, but as a musical. Unsurprisingly, this plan was dropped very quickly. Webber did manage to make a train theme musical, however, when he created Starlight Express. Originally showing in London in 1984, this musical was performed on Broadway in New York City, as well as tours across Japan and Australia. Since the show is still running in Germany, it is one of the longest running musicals in history. Starlight Express is also expected to start shows in London again at some point in 2024. Skipping ahead about a decade now, by 1983, Wilbur Awdry's son Christopher picked up the pieces of his father's incomplete 27th book and finished it himself. Wilbur was so pleased with the finished product he suggested Christopher took over as the series' new author. With Clive Sponge on board as the new illustrator, Christopher agreed to carry on the railway series, and the first book of the Christopher Awdry era, Really Useful Engines, was published on the 12th of September 1983. However, Christopher faced many issues with getting his books published. The original publishing firm, Edmund Ward, had merged with Nicholas Kay in 1952 to become Kay and Ward. They were then bought by Heinemann in 1984 and then by Reed Children Books in 1987. The publishers had given Wilbur some minor requirements he had to meet in order to have his books published, and he often found ways to use them to his advantage, such as Duck and the Diesel Engine. However, during Christopher's tenure as author, he faced much larger and stricter requirements that caused all sorts of problems for him. In 1979, a woman called Britt Allcroft acquired the right to adapt the Railway series for television. After 2 failed attempts already, the Awdry family didn't hold out much hope, but Allcroft was determined. So determined, in fact, that she even mortgaged her own house so she had enough funding for the first season. First of all, she rounded up a production crew, including, but not limited to, Robert Cardona as producer, David Mitton as director, and Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell as the musical composers. Allcroft also used Cardona and Mitton's own company, Clearwater Features, to film the series. In 1983, Allcroft approached Beatles drummer Ringo Starr and asked him if he would narrate the series, as in her opinion, she felt he had the perfect voice. Starr refused initially, as he hadn't read the Railway series himself. However, after he'd read some of the books, he changed his mind and was happy to lend his voice to the role of narrator. He signed on in December of that year, and even managed to record his narration of all 26 episodes of the first series in just 8 days. This included 4 episodes that had to be re-recorded due to the tone of his voice. The show, named Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, and later shortened to just Thomas and Friends, was filmed using Gauge 1 models in Clearwater's in-house studio in Battersea in London, and adapted most of the stories from the first 8 books. However, some stories were merged together into a single episode, such as Gordon's Whistle and Henry's Sneeze being merged into Whistles and Sneezes, and some stories were used later on, or in some cases weren't even used at all. Series 1 was first aired in the UK on the 9th of October in 1984, less than a month after the release of Christopher Awdry's second book, James and the Diesel Engines. The following year, in 1985, Awdry set about writing his next book. For the last 3 years, the Tallyclin Railway's number 3, Sir Hayden, had been painted to look like Sir Handel. This inspired Awdry to write a book all about Sir Handel's visit to the Tallyclin Railway and what happened back on the Scarlowry Railway whilst he was away. Meanwhile, following the success of the first series of Thomas and Friends, Allcroft moved production to a larger studio in Shepperton in Surrey. But there was a problem. At this point, Allcroft was only allowed to adapt existing stories and not create her own. However, the next 8 books in the series contained 2 about the Scarlowry Railway, and the film crew hadn't yet found a way to fit all of the necessary motors and servos into such small models. There are also very few stories in these 8 books about Thomas, despite having been turned into the main character. To solve this, Awdry was asked by his publisher to write a book all about Thomas that could be adapted for the series. Reluctantly, Awdry wrote the book more about Thomas the Tank Engine. He later stated that this was his least favourite book as it was written in a hurry to meet a deadline. This might explain why most of the stories in this book were not up to the usual standard as the rest of the series was. This also meant Awdry was unable to write the book he wanted to have published, Barry the Rescue Engine. This would have been about an engine that was saved from Barry's scrapyard in Wales and brought to Sodor to be restored. Awdry made more attempts to have this book published, but that never happened. However, Wild Nor'Wester has created a mini-series called Barry the Rescue Engine, which gives us an idea as to what might have happened in the book if it was published. I will leave links to this mini-series down in the description below somewhere if you want to check it out later. Despite this setback, Awdry continued writing books. He released Gordon the High-Speed Engine in 1987, all about Gordon struggling with his age. Toby Trucks and Trouble, released in 1988, all about the difficulties Toby and Percy faced whilst Thomas was unavailable. Thomas and the Twins, released in 1989, about Thomas's experiences with Bill and Bernard on the Brendon branch. Jock the New Engine in 1990, all about the latest addition to the Arlesdale Railway. And then, during the Great Railway Show in 1990, the National Railway Museum in York announced that a copy of the Railway series would have a permanent home in the museum's library of railway books. This inspired Awdry to fictionalise the whole event in his next book, Thomas and the Great Railway Show, in which Thomas travelled to York to take part in these celebrations. The year after, Awdry released Thomas Comes Home, which was all about what happened on Sodor whilst Thomas was away. It's safe to say that despite having issues with his publishers, Christopher's stint as author was going rather well. The same could not be said for the TV adaptation, however. Cardona and Mitten were sick of coming up with ideas for Thomas and Friends, only for Allcroft to overrule them. In the end, they were so fed up that after Series 2 was finished, they both walked out in order to create their own show, taking Mike O'Donnell, Junior Campbell, and most of the production crew with them. They instead went on to make the show Tugs, a show about anthropomorphic tugboats working in a big harbour on the west coast of America. The show had a few teething troubles, admittedly, and the biggest by far, though, was that Cardona and Mitten's company, Clearwater Features, went bankrupt shortly after the show's first and only series was finished, and so sadly it was over before it really began. Allcroft meanwhile had much more success. She had set out to sell Thomas and Friends to America. In order to fit the stricter American TV schedule, however, she created a new show called Shining Time Station. This American adaptation first aired on the 29th of January in 1989. The show starred Diddy Conn as station manager Stacey Jones, and Ringo Starr reprising his role as narrator, as well as playing Mr. Conductor, an 8-inch tall magic man that lives in a railway mural painted on the wall. In this show, some children would come to Shining Time Station and would have to solve a problem, and whilst they search for an answer, Mr. Conductor will tell them a couple of stories, at which point it would cut to an episode of Thomas and Friends redubbed using American terminology. After Allcroft's success in America, she then set about creating Series 3. Cardona had moved back to Canada to work on another tugboat show called Theodore Tugboat. But Mitten, O'Donnell, Campbell and most of the production crew returned to Thomas and Friends, bringing all their newfound knowledge with them. Production was soon underway, but since Clearwater was gone, Allcroft ran the show under her own company, the Britt Allcroft Company. Progress was good, until Ringo Starr said he wouldn't narrate any more episodes, as he'd wanted to focus on his music career instead. In the UK dub, he was replaced by Michael Angelis, who, incidentally, is the show's longest-running narrator, sticking around until the end of Series 16. Meanwhile, on Shining Time Station and in the American dub, Ringo Starr was replaced by foul-mouthed American comedian George Carlin. However, at this point, Allcroft was running out of stories that could be easily adapted, and so she made a new arrangement in which she could more loosely adapt stories, as well as magazine stories, and some new stories that Allcroft and her team had written themselves. Series 3 was a hit with children, but it didn't go down so well with the Awdry family. Wilbert Awdry specifically having issues with Henry's Forest in particular, as he said it could not happen in real life, as it is against railway regulations for a train to stop without first informing the signalman that you had done so. Whilst this was going on, Awdry released the book Henry and the Express in 1993. Then in 1994, the Dean Forest Railway in Gloucestershire made a request for a book about one of their engines. Audrey chose to write about a saddle tank engine called Wilbert, named after his father and the Dean Forest Railway's president at the time, Wilbert Audrey. Wilbert the Forest engine was written about Wilbert coming to help out on Sodor, whilst the Fat Controller was looking for a new engine to help out permanently. However, Audrey didn't write all of the stories in this book himself. The first story in the book, Percy's Porridge, was actually written by a class at Abingdon School as part of a creative writing exercise, and as such, this book is dedicated to them. Series 4 was released the same year and finally introduced the narrow gauge engines. In fact, 15 of the 26 episodes were based off of the narrow gauge engines. As you can see in this picture here, the models are too small to fit the motors and wires and battery inside them, so what couldn't fit in the locomotive was left sat behind them, as seen here with Duncan. To get around this, most scenes saw a locomotive hauling either a red coach, like the handle is here, or a van or a boxcar, in order to hide all of these things. However, in some cases, the wires were still visible. In 1995, the Railway series celebrated its Golden Jubilee, 50 years of print. To mark this auspicious occasion, Audrey wrote Thomas and the Fat Controller's engines, in which we saw just how much trouble the engines on Sodor went through for their own Jubilee celebrations. In 1996, Christopher Audrey wrote the book New Little Engine, about how all the engines on the Skarloey Railway were coping whilst waiting for a new engine to be built. This of course was inspired by the Tally-Klin Railway recently acquiring a new engine of its own. Unfortunately, at this point things seemed to go quite badly for both the Audrey family and for Allcroft. On the 21st of March 1997, Wilbert Audrey passed away peacefully in Stroud in Gloucestershire. Subsequently, there was no Railway series book or TV series to be published or released that year. Allegedly this was out of respect for Audrey's death, but the truth is a little more controversial than that. In 1998, Allcroft decided she wanted to take the TV series and the franchise as a whole in a different direction. In order to do this, she was able to buy the copyrights from new publishers, Egmont Publishing, for £13.5 million or $16.4 million. About £24.8 million or $30 million when adjusted for inflation. And this meant that in order for Christopher Audrey to publish any more books, he would now require Allcroft's permission to do so, but for some unknown reason she wouldn't give it. Instead, and despite Audrey's numerous warnings, Egmont published a reformatted version of the Railway series, which received such a negative feedback that the series was scrapped entirely. Audrey and his wife then set up their own company called Sodor Enterprises so Audrey could continue writing books. But after many attempts to buy the copyright back were unsuccessful, he wrote stories about other engines on other railways instead. Allcroft, meanwhile, had her mind set on creating a theatrical movie, but first she had to prove that her production crew were up to the task, and so Series 5 was created. First released in 1998, Series 5 was mostly made up of original episodes, involving a lot more crashes and accidents than other series. It also featured new models for the Skarloey Railway engines that ran on L-gauge track and were large enough to fit their motors, servos and battery inside them. The final change was that George Carlin had stepped down as narrator of the US dub and was replaced by American actor Alec Baldwin. Allcroft appeared to have been successful with Series 5, as in the year 2000 she released the movie Thomas and the Magic Railroad, with Alec Baldwin reprising his role as narrator, as well as taking on the mantle of Mr. Conductor, alongside former Captain America actor Peter Fonda and newcomer Mara Wilson. The idea of this movie was to bring the whole Thomas and Friends franchise to a global audience, and whilst it was successful in doing so, it also alienated most of the existing audience. The TV series, up until this point, had prided itself on, like the Railway series, trying to make stories as realistic as possible. But this movie had undone all of that hard work by essentially saying it's just magic. This seemed to annoy existing fans, and as such, the movie performed terribly. There are some that claim it would have performed better if we'd had the original director's cut instead of the final version, but who's to say, really? That could go either way. Regardless, the movie that did end up in theatres performed so terribly that Allcroft ended up losing control of her own company. The Britt Allcroft Company, now being renamed Gulane, had their own ideas for Series 6, and in comparison to the previous series, something seemed to be a little off. This was also the final series of the US dub to be narrated by Alec Baldwin. Series 7 onwards, he was replaced by Michael Brandon. Shortly after the completion of Series 6, Gulane was bought out by Hit Entertainment. With Hit in charge, Allcroft was removed from her position as executive producer and demoted to a consultant for Series 7, the last series that she was involved with. This was also the last series to involve David Mitton, as he was planning to step down and retire when the series was over. Unfortunately, this was also the last series to use music by Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell. Now, at this time, there were plans for a spin-off series called Jack and the Pack, which was about a group of construction vehicles. However, partway through production of this mini-series, Gulane had been bought by Hit, and since Hit already owned Bob the Builder, another TV show about construction vehicles, they believed this show was pointless and so it was scrapped. However, the 13 episodes that had already been made were released on DVD as the miniseries Jack and the Pack, renamed Jack and the Sodor Construction Company, 2 years later. And so, what was commonly known as the classic era of Thomas had ended, and the Hit era had begun. Hit released a new series every year, starting with Series 8 in 2004, Series 9 in 2005, and Series 10 in 2006, as well as releasing their own disastrous feature-length special, Calling All Engines. From these series, we could tell that unlike Audrey, and to some extent Allcroft, Hit had no interest in making realistic stories that were suitable for the whole family, and instead turned Thomas and Friends into a generic children's show, leaving the Railway series' reputation and legacy in tatters. In 2007, the same year that Series 11 was aired, a successful campaign by Sodor Island fan site saw the Railway series brought back to print. And so 10 years later than he originally had planned, Christopher Awdry published Thomas and Victoria, all about an old coach called Victoria that Thomas found in the station master's garden and convinced the Fat Controller to have restored. This led many people to assume that the Railway series would be back, but in reality that was not to be. In 2008, Hit released a better movie, The Great Discovery, in which Thomas rediscovered a long-lost town called Great Waterton. This was also the only time that narration was provided by former James Bond actor Pierce Brosnan, as well as the last time the show would ever be fully using models. The same year, Hit released Series 12, which used CGI faces for all the characters, and human characters were now CGI as well. This was in preparation for HIT's plan to move the rest of the series moving forward to Nitrogen Studios in Canada and be full CGI. 2008 was also the start of the TV series' main rival. Dick Rothkopf, former CEO of Learning Curve, the company that used to distribute Thomas toys, looked at the TV series and believed that the lessons they taught were outdated and that the characters were just too mean. He believed he could do much better than this, and so he created his own show, Chuggington, a CGI show about 3 young engines trying to make their way in the world and learning lessons along the way. More recent series of the TV series have been compared to Chuggington, as characters have similar movement styles, though personally I do believe that these may have been exaggerated. In 2009 we received the first full CGI Thomas content in the form of the movie Hero of the Rails. This saw the beginning of what is now known as the Miller era, as Sharon Miller was head writer at the time. This, for most fans, is usually seen as the least favourite era, as most episodes use the same basic 3 strikes formula. If you've seen one episode, then you've pretty much seen them all, starting with Series 13 released in 2010. This was closely followed by the truly bizarre Misty Island Rescue, and then Series 14. In 2011, HIT released Series 15. At some point the same year, they also released another movie, Day of the Diesels, which was all about the Diesels trying to take over the Steamworks. Let's be honest, it is as ridiculous as it sounds. Sadly, this was also the year the Railway series truly did come to an end, with the final book, Thomas and His Friends, released on the 6th of July. This book was all about how Thomas and his friends prepared for Wilbert Awdry's centenary celebrations, his 100th birthday were he still alive. As such, this book is dedicated to him, and since it is the last book in the Railway series, it is the only book to finish with the words, "The End." But whilst the Railway series has come to an end, the story continues. In 2012, HIT released Series 16, and the narrow gauge engines, who had been absent for a few years, made their big return in the movie Blue Mountain Mystery. This saw the end of the Miller era. This was also the year that HIT Entertainment was bought by Mattel Television. However, Thomas and Friends still used the HIT brand up until 2016. In 2013, Mattel made numerous changes. First, they moved production to Arc Productions. Then, Mark Moraghan took over as narrator in both the UK and US dubs, until season 21, where Thomas took over as narrator, and Andrew Brenner, who had worked on the series before, took over as head writer, starting what is now known as the Brenner era. Brenner and his team tried to fix many of the issues caused by HIT and by Miller. However, they did of course face a few issues, as many of their ideas were overruled by Mattel. Mattel's interference was subtle at first, but it did become more obvious over time. The Brenner era kicked off with the movie King of the Railway, released in 2013. This movie saw the real-life engine Stephenson's rocket, known in the show as Stephen, come to Sodor. In 2014, we received Series 17, and yet another movie, Tale of the Brave. Towards the end of this year and the start of the following year, we received Series 18. In 2015, the Railway series hit a big milestone as it was its 70th anniversary. To celebrate this occasion, Mattel released a new movie, Thomas and Friends: The Adventure Begins, a CGI adaptation of the first 2 books of the Railway series. They also released a second movie the same year, Sodor's Legend of the Lost Treasure, in which Thomas was sent to help out on the new branch line and also went hunting for treasure whilst he was there. Finally, we also received Series 19. What a busy year. In 2016, Mattel released the next movie, The Great Race, which was all about a railway competition on the mainland, and many of the engines from Sodor were going to compete. We also saw many engines from around the world, including the world-famous Flying Scotsman. We also received Series 20 around the same sort of time. In 2017, we received the movie Journey Beyond Sodor, which was supposed to be Thomas's first big adventure somewhere other than on Sodor. Unless you count Misty Island Rescue, where he spent most of the movie on Misty Island, and The Great Race, where about half of the movie set on the mainland. This was also the year that Series 21 was released. In 2018, the show underwent a big change following the release of the movie Big World, Big Adventures, in which Thomas would travel all over the world. This was to set up the next batch of seasons, released between 2018 and 2021, in which Thomas would go around the world and meet engines from different countries for half of the episodes, and the other half would be set back on Sodor, looking at what was going on whilst he was away. It seems that the Wubber era, as is often called, wasn't too popular with fans, and massive changes to some of the toy ranges didn't really help either. But considering what came next, it could have been a whole lot worse. And then it was. After Series 24 was complete, production started on Series 25, meant to be aired in 2021. However, this was then cancelled in favour of this. I really cannot describe to you just how ridiculous this is. I mean, this reboot makes Chuggington look like it's mature. Chuggington of all things! Honestly, what were they thinking? Anyway, starting in 2021, this horrendous reboot had gone down as the worst idea in the franchise's history. Rightfully so. And to add salt to that wound, Mattel has recently renewed it until at least 2025. Oh boy. And so with that, one of the longest running children's shows had come to an end. Almost 80 years after the characters had been created. And that's the key thing. Yes, both the Railway series and the TV series have ended, but they've left an important legacy. 42 books, 24 series of TV, 14 feature-length specials. They have been an integral part of people's childhoods for over 80 years, and for some people, even more than that. And not just in the UK either, but all over the world. America, Australia, Germany, Switzerland, Korea, Japan, China, you name it. It's been there. The Railway series is at least partially available in 8 different languages. The TV series is at least partially available in 57 different languages. 58 if you count the American dub. It's all the creation of countless toys that allow people to follow their passions, whether it be to do with trains, movie making, model making, or anything else that was involved in the creation of these series. It also saw the creation of at least 3 other shows and countless other series on YouTube. All of this from one man telling his son a story over 80 years ago. The series may be over, but the legacy it has left behind will see that it lives on forever. And that, folks, brings us to the present day. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. I'll see you again soon.